Meryl Streep was hurrying through the crowded lobby of the Lincoln Center, elegantly dressed for the New York Philharmonic's Winter Gala, when a hesitant voice called her name from near the coat check. A voice that transported her instantly, back 40 years to a classroom in Bernardsville, New Jersey. What happened next would become the subject of hushed conversations among the cultural elite of Manhattan, and eventually spark a movement that would transform lives across the city. But it began with a simple, desperate request for $100 from someone Meryl hadn't seen since high school graduation. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. It was a bitter December evening, the kind that turned breath into visible clouds and numbed fingers within minutes. Outside the prestigious Lincoln Center, limousines and luxury cars formed an elegant procession, depositing passengers dressed in their finest winter attire, diamonds glittering against dark coats as they hurried toward the warmth and music awaiting inside. Among them, Meryl moved with practiced grace, nodding occasionally to familiar faces. Her silver hair was swept into a simple but elegant updo, her midnight blue gown visible beneath a cashmere wrap that offered protection against the chill. 2 steps behind her, Rebecca, her assistant of 8 years, fielded messages on her phone, while maintaining a watchful eye on their surroundings. "Miss Streep, the director mentioned he'd like a moment before the performance," Rebecca murmured, glancing up from her screen. Meryl nodded, her pace quickening slightly through the opulent lobby where New York's elite mingled, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum beneath the crystal chandeliers. At 75, she still commanded the same presence that had defined her career, her posture straight, her eyes alert and observant. It was those observant eyes that caught a flicker of movement near the coat check, a woman partially hidden, behind a column, watching her with an intensity that felt different from the usual admiring glances she received. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, something that made Meryl slow her pace despite the waiting director. "Meryl?" The voice was barely audible above the crowd, tentative and uncertain, yet it sliced through decades of memory with startling precision. Meryl stopped, turning fully toward the sound. The woman who stepped hesitantly forward was in her early 70s, her grey hair cut in a practical bob that framed a face lined with experience. She wore a navy blue coat that had once been good quality, but now showed wear at the cuffs and collar. Most striking were her eyes, the same clear, intelligent blue that had once sparkled with literary ambition in advanced English class decades ago. "Eleanor," Meryl said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Eleanor Mason?" The woman's face transformed with relief. "You remember, I wasn't sure you would." Rebecca moved protectively closer to Meryl, her professional instincts triggered by the unscheduled interaction, but Meryl gestured subtly for her to step back. "Of course I remember. You were the only one who could quote more Shakespeare than I could." Meryl smiled, studying her former classmate with growing concern. Beneath the social pleasantries, she noted the slight tremor in Eleanor's hands, the careful way she leaned against the column as if for support, the worn edges of not just her coat, but her dignity. "That was a lifetime ago," Eleanor replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm sorry to approach you like this. I've been waiting, hoping to see you." Around them, the lobby began to empty as attendees moved toward the concert hall. A chime sounded, indicating 10 minutes until the performance. "Miss Streep," Rebecca reminded gently, "the director." Meryl nodded acknowledgement, but didn't move. "Eleanor, are you attending the performance?" Eleanor's gaze dropped to the marble floor. "No, I'm here because I heard you would be." Her voice lowered further. "I need to ask you something, and I wouldn't if there were any other option." The tremor in Eleanor's hands intensified. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, holding it out with fingers that betrayed both arthritis and nervousness. "I need help," she said simply, the 3 words clearly costing her dearly. "It's for my medication. I just need $100 to cover it until my Social Security comes next week." Rebecca's expression tightened with the wariness of someone who had fielded countless requests from strangers trying to access her employer's wealth and generosity, But Meryl's reaction was entirely different. Something deeper than recognition flickered across her face, a complex emotion that mixed shock, compassion, and a profound understanding. For this wasn't just any request, and Eleanor wasn't just any person from her past. The folded paper was a prescription, and the woman standing before her had once been the brightest writing talent in their school, the one their teachers had predicted would see her name on bookstore shelves long before Meryl's would appear on theatre marquees. "The concert can wait," Meryl said decisively, turning to Rebecca. "Please let the director know I've been unavoidably detained." Rebecca hesitated, glancing between the women. "Security protocol suggests—" "This is Eleanor Mason," Meryl interrupted, with gentle firmness. "We've known each other since we were 14. Please make my apologies for the delay." As Rebecca stepped away to make the call, Meryl turned back to Eleanor, who stood clutching the prescription, shame and relief warring on her face. "I wouldn't ask," Eleanor began again, "but the pharmacy—" Meryl laid a gentle hand on her old friend's arm. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk." A security guard approached, having noticed the interaction. "Everything all right, Miss Streep? They're holding the start for you." Meryl smiled, the warm, genuine smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "Please tell them to begin without me. I've just run into an old friend." The unexpected reconnection between a Hollywood legend and her former classmate in the gleaming lobby of Lincoln Center was just the beginning. Neither woman could have predicted how this moment, a desperate request born of necessity and a compassionate response born of memory, would eventually impact not just their lives, but those of countless others. As Meryl guided Eleanor toward the small cafe tucked discreetly in the corner of the lobby, away from curious eyes, the prescription for $100 worth of medication became the first page in a new chapter that would transform both their stories in ways that would indeed shock everyone who witnessed what came next. The small cafe tucked into the corner of Lincoln Center offered a pocket of relative privacy amid the evening's festivities. While orchestral music began to fill the concert hall, Meryl Streep and Eleanor Mason sat across from each other at a marble-topped table, 2 steaming cups of tea between them. The contrast between the women was striking. Meryl, in her designer evening gown, and Eleanor in her worn navy coat, the physical manifestation of lives that had diverged dramatically from the same starting point. "I never thought I'd be in this position," Eleanor said softly, cradling the teacup in hands that trembled slightly. "Asking anyone for money, especially you." Her gaze remained fixed on the swirling tea, pride still evident in her straight posture. Despite everything, Meryl studied her old friend with compassion that held no trace of pity. "Tell me what happened, Eleanor. Last I heard you were writing for The Atlantic." A faint smile flickered across Eleanor's face. "You kept track of me?" "Of course I did. Your piece on healthcare inequality was brilliant. That was— what? 15 years ago." 16, Eleanor corrected. Everything changed after that. As the concert's first movement began nearby, Eleanor's story emerged in measured, dignified phrases. She had built a respectable career as a journalist and essayist, never achieving the literary stardom their teachers had predicted, but earning enough to live comfortably while pursuing work that mattered. She had married David, a kind and thoughtful high school English teacher, and they had built a life focused on words, ideas, and making a modest difference in the world. "David died suddenly 12 years ago," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Heart attack. While jogging. He was only 63. Meryl reached across the table, briefly touching Eleanor's hand. No words were necessary. "I was managing," Eleanor continued. "The insurance covered most things, and I had regular writing assignments. Then my mother's Alzheimer's progressed to the point where she couldn't be alone." The familiar story unfolded. Eleanor had become her mother's caregiver, gradually taking on more responsibility as deadlines were missed and assignments dwindled. Her savings cushioned the transition at first, but 3 years stretched into 7 as her mother declined. "I don't regret those years," Eleanor said firmly. "Mom took care of me. I took care of her. That's the way it should be." "And your writing?" Meryl asked gently. "Notes in journals, ideas for children's books I'd sketch out while Mom napped. Nothing publishable." Eleanor took a sip of tea. By the time she passed, I was 68 and effectively retired in editors' eyes, though not by choice. Rebecca approached discreetly, placing a small plate of cookies on the table before withdrawing to a respectful distance. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor, whose eyes reflected momentary embarrassment at the thought she might be perceived as hungry as well as financially strapped. Then came the diagnosis, Eleanor continued, ignoring the cookies. Multiple sclerosis. The tremors started small, just enough to make typing difficult. She held up her hands, which now shook visibly. The progression has been relatively slow but steady. And your health insurance, Meryl asked, already suspecting the answer. Ran out 2 months ago. I was on a COBRA plan after losing my last steady writing gig, but that has time limits. Eleanor finally reached for the prescription she had placed on the table. This medication helps control the symptoms, makes it possible for me to function independently. Without it, she didn't finish the thought. Meryl took the prescription, studying it for a moment before folding it carefully and placing it in her evening bag. I'll have Rebecca fill this tonight. There's an all-night pharmacy near my apartment. Just until next week, Eleanor emphasized. When my Social Security comes, I can repay— Eleanor, Meryl interrupted gently. We graduated together in 1967. Some things transcend repayment. A brief, comfortable silence fell between them, filled with shared memories of a time before fame and illness. Successes and setbacks had defined their paths. Do you still write? Meryl asked finally. Eleanor's expression shifted subtly. In my head. My hands don't cooperate well with keyboards anymore, and handwriting— She demonstrated the tremor. Voice recognition software is an option, but that's another expense. What would you write if you could? Meryl's question held genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation. For the first time that evening, a spark lit in Eleanor's blue eyes. I have these children's stories about difficult subjects like illness and loss, but with a mouse protagonist named Mimi who helps children understand. I started creating them for my neighbor's daughter when her grandmother, my mother, began forgetting her name. Meryl leaned forward, intrigued. Have you shared them with anyone? Just the neighborhood children, Eleanor said with a small shrug. They seem to connect with them. Rebecca approached again, this time with quiet urgency. Ms. Streep, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Sharma is asking if you're still available to discuss the children's hospital benefit. Meryl's eyes widened slightly with sudden inspiration. Actually, Rebecca, please ask Catherine if she can join us here for a moment. I think she might be interested in meeting Eleanor. As Rebecca departed on her mission, Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. Meryl, I didn't approach you to network or meet your doctor friends. I just needed the $100 for your prescription, Meryl finished. And you'll have it. But Catherine Sharma isn't just any doctor. She's a neurologist specializing in MS research at Mount Sinai, and she's heading a clinical trial that might interest you. Eleanor's composure briefly faltered. I can't afford experimental treatments. That's the point of clinical trials, Meryl said with a gentle smile. They need participants, and the medications are provided as part of the research. As the second movement of the concert played on without one of its most distinguished guests, Meryl reached into her evening bag and removed her checkbook. The $100 is for now, she said, writing with efficient strokes. But I think we can do better than temporary solutions, don't you? Eleanor watched, conflicting emotions crossing her face: gratitude, embarrassment, hope, and something else. The first tentative revival of her own sense of possibility that had been dormant for too long. I don't want charity, she said softly but firmly. Meryl looked up, her gaze direct and understanding. Good, because that's not what I'm offering. She tore the check carefully from the book. I'm offering a bridge, Eleanor. The rest of the journey is still yours to make. The arrival of Dr. Catherine Sharma transformed the quiet corner of the Lincoln Center Cafe into an impromptu medical consultation. Elegantly dressed for the gala in a crimson silk gown, the neurologist carried herself with the confident precision of someone accustomed to making life-altering decisions. Her dark hair was swept into a sophisticated updo, diamond earrings catching the light as she greeted Meryl with familiar warmth before turning her attention to Eleanor. Dr. Sharma, Catherine, is one of the leading MS specialists in the country, Meryl explained, making the introduction with deliberate normalcy, as if connecting an old friend to a renowned neurologist was an everyday occurrence. Please, call. Me, Kate, the doctor said, taking the seat Meryl offered. Her clinical gaze assessed Eleanor with professional interest, noting the tremor in her hands and the subtle signs of fatigue around her eyes, but her tone remained conversational rather than diagnostic. Meryl mentioned you're having difficulty with your current treatment plan. Eleanor straightened slightly, her dignity asserting itself. Currently, I'm having difficulty with access to my treatment plan. The medication works reasonably well when I can afford it. Kate nodded, respecting the clarification. Which medication are you currently prescribed? As Eleanor explained her medical history, Meryl observed the interaction with quiet attention. Rebecca had returned with a discreet shopping bag containing Eleanor's filled prescription, the immediate need addressed. While this more meaningful conversation unfolded, what struck Meryl most was Eleanor's articulate precision despite her circumstances. Her old friend spoke about her condition with the same thoughtful clarity that had once made her the star of their high school debate team. The clinical trial I'm leading focuses on a new combination therapy, Kate explained after listening carefully. We're seeing promising results in slowing progression and improving quality of life, particularly for patients in your age group. With your specific pattern of symptoms, Eleanor's expression remained guarded. And the cost to participants? The medication, monitoring and follow-up care are covered by the research grant, Kate replied. We're actually having difficulty recruiting enough participants in your demographic. Most clinical trials do. Your participation would be valuable to our research. Meryl watched as Eleanor processed this information, recognizing the careful mental calculations behind her friend's measured response. How often would I need to come to the hospital? Eleanor asked practically. Weekly for the first month, then monthly for follow-ups. Transportation can be arranged if that's a concern. Eleanor glanced at Meryl, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. Is that arrangement also part of the standard trial protocol, or is that Meryl's influence? Kate smiled, appreciating the directness. Patient transportation is covered by the grant. Meryl's influence is simply in making the introduction tonight, rather than you finding us through standard referral channels or the clinical trial website. Some of the tension left Eleanor's shoulders. I would need to review the information before committing. Of course, Kate said, reaching into her evening clutch and producing a business card. My office can send you the complete information package tomorrow. Take time to consider it. Discuss it with your primary physician if you have one. The orchestra's intermission had begun, and well-dressed patrons began filtering into the cafe area. Meryl noted Eleanor's increasing discomfort with the crowd. Rebecca, Meryl said quietly, could you arrange for a car to take Eleanor home when we've finished here? Eleanor shook her head firmly. The subway is fine. I've been navigating New York since before you were famous, Meryl. The gentle teasing marked the first glimpse of their old camaraderie, briefly bridging decades of separate lives. Kate excused herself to return to the gala, promising to have her office contact Eleanor the next day. As she departed, she leaned close to Meryl, whispering something that made Meryl nod with gratitude. You've created quite an efficient support system, Eleanor observed after Kate had gone, gesturing to Rebecca, who waited at a discreet distance. Your assistant fills prescriptions. Your doctor friend offers clinical trials. Kate would have offered the same to any qualified patient, Meryl corrected gently. But yes, I've been fortunate to build connections with remarkable people throughout my career. She paused, studying Eleanor with thoughtful eyes. The question is what you want to do next, beyond addressing the immediate medication need. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. I assumed I would return to my apartment, take my medication, and continue figuring out how to manage until things improve. And your writing? The children's stories about Mimi the mouse? A shadow of longing crossed Eleanor's face. A hobby at best. The publishing industry isn't exactly clamoring for 70-something debut authors with shaky hands. Meryl allowed a beat of silence before responding. Eleanor, do you remember Mrs. Callahan's creative writing class? What she told you after? You read your short story about the girl who found a wounded bird. For the first time that evening, a genuine smile transformed Eleanor's face. She said I had a gift for making difficult subjects accessible, that I could help people understand pain without flinching from it. Exactly, Meryl said, leaning forward. That gift doesn't disappear with age or physical challenges. If these stories are helping neighborhood children understand illness and loss, imagine what they could do for children in hospitals or families facing Alzheimer's or other conditions. Eleanor's composure wavered momentarily. That's a lovely thought. But the practical realities can be addressed, Meryl finished. Not as charity, Eleanor. As investment in work that matters. The check for $100 still lay on the table between them, untouched by Eleanor, despite her need. Meryl understood that the hesitation wasn't pride alone, but something deeper. Fear that accepting help meant surrendering the last shreds of self-determination that Eleanor had fought so hard to maintain. I'd like to meet next week, Meryl said, changing tactics. Not here, but at your place, if you're comfortable with that. I want to hear more about Mimi the mouse. Eleanor studied her former classmate, weighing the offer. You really want to hear my children's stories? I've spent 50 years interpreting stories for audiences, Meryl replied with simple honesty. Yes, I really want to hear yours. As the evening drew to a close, and they prepared to part ways, Meryl back to the gala, Eleanor to her apartment. With her filled prescription, Eleanor finally picked up the check, folding it carefully into her worn wallet. Next Tuesday at 2, she said. I'll make tea. Meryl smiled, recognizing the acceptance of the check for what it truly was. Not just receiving $100 for medication, but opening the door to possibilities beyond a simple request for help. The apartment building in Inwood stood in stark contrast to the elegant Lincoln Center, where Meryl and Eleanor had reconnected a week earlier. Built in the 1940s, the 6-story brick structure had seen better days, with a faded awning and worn stone steps leading to a security door with an intercom system that functioned only sporadically. Meryl arrived precisely at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, driven by her regular chauffeur in an understated sedan rather than the more conspicuous town car she typically used for events. Rebecca had offered to accompany her, but Meryl had declined. This wasn't a professional obligation or a charity appearance, it was a visit to an old friend. She carried only a small gift bag containing a selection of specialty teas and a state-of-the-art digital voice recorder, a thoughtful but practical offering that acknowledged Eleanor's trembling hands while respecting her creative potential. The elevator was out of order, so Meryl climbed 4 flights of stairs, noting the building's clean but worn hallways and the scent of someone's cooking that spoke of ordinary lives being lived behind closed doors. Eleanor's apartment was at the end of the hallway, 4F, its door distinguished by a small wreath of dried lavender. Eleanor opened the door after Meryl's gentle knock, her appearance markedly improved from their meeting the previous week. The tremor in her hands was less pronounced, and her complexion had more color. She wore a simple blue blouse and gray slacks, her silver hair neatly combed. The medication is working better, Meryl observed as she stepped inside. Eleanor nodded. Dr. Sharma called personally to discuss the trial. I have my first appointment tomorrow. The apartment was small, but immaculately kept, a testament to Eleanor's determination to maintain standards despite circumstances. A compact living area with bookshelves lining one wall opened to a tiny kitchen where a kettle was already whistling. Morning light streamed through windows that offered a distant view of the George Washington Bridge. You have quite a library, Meryl commented, scanning the crowded shelves that spoke volumes about Eleanor's intellectual life. Books are the last thing I'd ever part with, Eleanor replied, moving to the kitchen to prepare tea. When I had to downsize after selling Mum's house, I kept only what would fit on these shelves. Meryl noticed that despite the apartment's modest size, Eleanor had created a proper writing space in the corner, a small desk positioned to capture the best light, with a lamp, a weathered leather notebook, and several children's books stacked neatly beside a vintage typewriter. You still use a typewriter? Meryl asked, approaching the desk. Eleanor set a tea tray on the coffee table before answering. The keyboard is more forgiving than a computer. I can really strike the keys, which helps when my hands are uncooperative, though lately even that's been difficult. She gestured toward the leather notebook. Most of Mimi's adventures are in there, written in fragments whenever I have a good day. Meryl picked up the notebook, looking to Eleanor for permission. May I? At Eleanor's nod, she opened it carefully. Inside were pages of neat handwriting, interspersed with passages of increasingly uneven, typewritten text. But what immediately caught Meryl's attention were the illustrations, simple yet expressive pencil drawings of a small mouse with intelligent eyes and delicate whiskers. You drew these? Meryl asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Eleanor smiled faintly as she poured tea into mismatched but charming china cups. Another hobby. I used to sketch for the school newspaper, remember? Nothing professional, but enough to give Mimi a face. Meryl sat down with the notebook, carefully, turning pages as Eleanor brought her tea. The stories were simple but powerful, Mimi helping a young rabbit understand why Grandma Rabbit sometimes couldn't remember his name, Mimi explaining to a family of chipmunks why their father needed medicine that made him tired, Mimi showing a young bird how to find joy despite a wing that didn't work properly. These are extraordinary, Eleanor, Meryl said, her professional assessment genuine. The way you approach difficult subjects without condescension or false cheerfulness, children would connect with these immediately. They're just stories. Eleanor demurred, though her eyes betrayed pleasure at the praise. They're tools, Meryl corrected. Tools for children and families navigating difficult circumstances. She turned another page, finding a story about Mimi helping friends understand why the wise old owl had to leave the forest forever. Is this about David? Eleanor nodded, her composure momentarily wavering. Written for our neighbor's son. He was very attached to David, used to wait for him to come home from school so they could discuss whatever book he was reading. Meryl continued reading, increasingly impressed by both the writing quality and the emotional intelligence evident in each story. As she reached the final completed tale, she noticed several pages of rough notes for future Mimi adventures. You've created an entire world here, she observed. These deserve to be shared beyond your neighborhood children. Eleanor sighed, setting down her teacup. I looked into it once, about 5 years ago. Self-publishing costs were prohibitive and traditional publishers, she shrugged, form rejection letters when they bothered to respond at all. Meryl set the notebook down carefully and reached for the gift bag she had brought. I thought, you might say something like that, which is why I brought this. She removed the digital recorder and placed it on the table between them. What's that for? Eleanor asked. For Mimi, Meryl replied simply. Your hands may struggle with typing, but your voice is as clear and expressive as ever. Record your stories. Eleanor, I know someone who might be interested in hearing them. A publisher. Eleanor's tone held equal parts hope and skepticism. Julia Peterson at Little Harbor Press. They specialize in children's books addressing difficult life situations. Meryl's expression grew thoughtful. She's been looking for authentic voices, especially from authors with personal experience of the challenges they write about. Eleanor picked up the recorder, examining it. And you think she'd consider my stories? Because Meryl Streep recommended them. I think she'd consider them because they're good, Meryl corrected. My name might get the manuscript read, but only quality will get it published. She paused, watching Eleanor carefully. This isn't charity, Eleanor. It's recognition of talent. For ye. A long moment Eleanor was silent, the recorder cradled in her trembling hands. Then, with a decisive motion, she pressed the record button. Mimi the brave mouse lived in a hollow tree near the edge of Whispering Woods, she began, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor in her hands. She wasn't the biggest mouse, or the fastest mouse, but she noticed things that other animals sometimes missed. Meryl sat back, listening as Eleanor's storytelling transformed the small apartment. In that moment, she wasn't seeing a former classmate who had fallen on hard times, but a writer finding her voice again, a voice that deserved to be heard. The conference room at Little Harbor Press hummed with an energy that belied the early morning hour. Julia Peterson, the publisher's founder and editorial director, sat at the head of the table, her attention fixed on the digital recorder playing Eleanor's voice. Around her, the children's book editorial team leaned forward in their chairs, captivated by the story of Mimi the brave mouse helping a young hedgehog understand why her mother needed to sleep so much since beginning her special medicine. Julia paused the recording, her expression thoughtful. The authenticity is remarkable. No sentimentality, yet deeply moving. She looked up at Meryl, who sat quietly observing the team's reactions. And these were written years ago, just for neighborhood children. Most of them, Meryl confirmed. Eleanor has been capturing difficult experiences through Mimi's adventures for nearly a decade, without any thought of publication. A younger editor wiped away a tear. The metaphors are perfect for children, using the hedgehog's quills to explain how the medicine protects the mother, but also makes her tired and sometimes prickly. It's brilliant. Julia tapped her pen against her notebook. I'd like to meet Eleanor, not because of your connection to her, Meryl, but because these stories have something special. They're honest in a way most children's books about illness aren't. Meryl smiled, satisfied but not surprised. She had known Julia for years and trusted her professional judgment implicitly. She started Dr. Sharma's clinical trial last week. The early response has been promising. That's wonderful news for her health, Julia replied, but I'm interested in her as an author, not as a charity case. Is she open to constructive feedback? Would she be willing to develop additional stories if these do well? You can ask her yourself, Meryl suggested. I think you'll find she's retained all the intellectual rigor that made her the editor of our high school literary magazine. As the meeting concluded with plans for Julia to meet Eleanor the following week, Meryl reflected on the month that had passed since their chance encounter at Lincoln Center. The transformation had been subtle but significant, not just in Eleanor's improving health thanks to the clinical trial, but in the rekindled purpose that animated her conversations. That afternoon, Meryl arrived at Mount Sinai Hospital for Eleanor's scheduled appointment with Dr. Sharma. They had fallen into an easy routine. Meryl would accompany Eleanor to her weekly treatments, using the time to listen to new story recordings, or simply catch up like the old friends they were rediscovering themselves to be. In the waiting room, Eleanor was already seated, reviewing a printed document with careful attention. She looked up as Meryl approached, her eyes bright with a clarity that had been absent during their first reunion. Progress report looks good, Eleanor said by way of greeting, handing Meryl the paper. My inflammatory markers are down, and the tremor measurement shows an 18% improvement. Meryl scanned the medical information, noting the clinical language that documented Eleanor's response to the treatment. Kate seems pleased, she observed. She says I'm their star patient in my age group, Eleanor replied with a hint of pride. Though I suspect that has more to do with my consistent attendance than any medical miracle. A nurse appeared at the doorway. Ms. Mason, we're ready for you. As they followed the nurse to the treatment room, Eleanor continued in a lower voice. Julia Peterson called me yesterday. Did she? Meryl kept her tone casual, though she had been expecting this development. She wants to meet next week to discuss a potential 3-book deal for Mimi. Eleanor's voice remained measured, but her eyes revealed her excitement. She mentioned an advance that would cover my rent for 6 months. That's wonderful news, Meryl said genuinely. What do you think? Eleanor settled into the treatment chair, extending her arm for the nurse to check her IV site. I think I'm cautiously optimistic. She made it clear this isn't about my connection to you. In fact, she grilled me quite thoroughly about my writing process and future story ideas. That sounds like Julia, Meryl laughed. She once rejected a manuscript from Robert Redford's granddaughter because it lacked authentic voice. The nurse completed the IV setup and the treatment began its slow drip into Eleanor's system. When they were alone again, Eleanor's expression grew more serious. I need to ask you something important, Meryl, and I need complete honesty. Meryl nodded, recognizing the gravity in her friend's tone. Always. Is this real? Eleanor gestured, vaguely to encompass her situation. The clinical trial, the publisher's interest, is this happening because my work deserves it, or because you're opening doors no one else could open? The question hung between them, loaded with Eleanor's lifelong commitment to earning her place through merit rather than connections. Meryl considered her response carefully. Both, she finally said. My connection opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to you. That's the reality of privilege and influence, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Eleanor nodded, appreciating the candor. But Meryl continued, Doors open every day for people who have nothing valuable to offer once they step through. Julia wouldn't consider publishing Mimi if the stories weren't exceptional, regardless of who made the introduction. And Dr. Sharma would have accepted any qualified patient into her trial. The fact that I know her meant you learned about the opportunity, but your medical response is entirely your own. Eleanor absorbed this, her fingers absently tracing the IV line delivering medication. I've spent my career writing about systems that privilege some and exclude others. It feels strange to benefit from that same system. The system exists, whether we acknowledge it or not, Meryl replied. The question is what we do with our access to it. A contemplative silence settled between them, broken only by the steady beep of the infusion pump. I received a check yesterday, Eleanor finally said. The first installment of the advance from Little Harbor. I've already spoken with the building manager about paying my back rent. Meryl smiled. That must feel good. It does, Eleanor admitted. But do you know what feels even better? I hired a part-time assistant, a nursing student who lives in my building. She's going to help with transcription and organization for 4 hours a week. That's perfect, Meryl said, genuinely pleased. Creating opportunity that extends beyond. For yourself. Eleanor's expression softened. You said you were offering a bridge, not a handout. I think I understand that better now. She gestured to the IV. This medication is healing my body, but the work, having purpose again, that's healing something deeper. Outside the hospital window, afternoon sunlight illuminated the Manhattan skyline, glinting off glass towers and casting long shadows across the city streets. Somewhere in that urban landscape, a publisher was preparing contracts for Mimi's adventures. A nursing student was anticipating her new part-time job, and Dr. Sharma was reviewing Eleanor's promising test results. The bridge was being built, one careful connection at a time. Children's Hospital of New York Presbyterian sparkled with unusual excitement on a bright April morning, 3 months after Meryl and Eleanor's chance encounter at Lincoln Center. The normally subdued 5th floor common room had been transformed, with colorful banners featuring a small gray mouse with bright eyes and an inquisitive expression. Staff members in their hospital scrubs mingled with publishing professionals in business attire, while children in wheelchairs and hospital gowns were positioned in a semicircle facing a small podium decorated with the Little Harbor Press logo. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands now steady enough to hold the advance copy of Mimi Helps Grandma Remember, the first of her 3-book deal to reach publication. The cover illustration showed Mimi guiding an elderly rabbit through a garden, pointing out flowers. That triggered memories. Professional illustrator Sophia Chen had brought Eleanor's simple sketches to life with watercolors that captured both whimsy and dignity, no small feat for a children's book about Alzheimer's disease. Nervous? Julia Peterson asked, taking the seat beside Eleanor. Terrified, Eleanor admitted with a small smile. I've written about presidential campaigns and interviewed world leaders, but I've never faced an audience of critical 5-year-olds before. Julia laughed. They're actually the most honest critics you'll ever have. If they love it, it's genuine. Dr. Catherine Sharma arrived, making her way through the gathering to greet Eleanor warmly. Your latest results came in yesterday, she said quietly. The improvement is holding steady. How are you feeling? Better than I have in years, Eleanor replied truthfully. Whether that's the medication, the sense of purpose, or some combination, I'm not questioning it. Kate squeezed her shoulder gently before moving to find a seat. The room continued to fill as hospital staff brought in more children, some attached to IV poles, others carrying stuffed animals for comfort. Parents joined them, their faces bearing the distinctive mixture of hope and exhaustion that Eleanor had come to recognize during her own visits to the hospital. Rebecca appeared at the entrance, scanning the room efficiently before stepping aside to allow Meryl to enter. Though she wore simple black slacks and a cream blouse rather than evening finery, her arrival still created a ripple of recognition through the room. She carried herself with the same grace that had made her a screen legend, but her smile held genuine warmth as she spotted Eleanor and made her way to the front. Ready for your debut? Meryl asked, taking the seat Julia had vacated. Eleanor gestured toward the assembled children. They're the ones who matter today. I just hope Mimi helps them somehow. Dr. Wilson, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, stepped to the podium to begin the event. Today, we're honored to host the first public reading of a very special new book series that will help children and families navigate difficult medical journeys. As the introduction continued, Eleanor leaned closer to Meryl. "I didn't expect media," she whispered, noticing several photographers and a videographer from the hospital's communications team. "Hospital publicity only," Meryl assured her. "No, outside press. Just documentation for their donor newsletter." The pediatrician concluded his remarks by introducing acclaimed actress Meryl Streep, who has graciously agreed to read today's story. A murmur of excitement rippled through the young audience as Meryl approached the podium. Some of the older children recognized her, while the younger ones simply responded to the heightened anticipation of the adults around them. Meryl took the podium with the natural ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. She adjusted the microphone and smiled at the assembled children. "I'm so happy to be here today to share a very special story with you," she began. "This book was written by my friend Eleanor, who is here with us today." She gestured toward Eleanor, who gave a small wave to the children. "Eleanor wrote this story because she knows what it's like when someone you love has trouble remembering things." A little girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. "My grandpa forgets my name sometimes," she said matter-of-factly. Meryl nodded with genuine understanding. "That can be confusing, can't it? Well, that's exactly what happens to the little rabbit in our story. Let's find out how Mimi the mouse helps him." She opened the book, angling it so the children could see the illustrations, and began to read in the warm, expressive voice that had interpreted countless characters over decades. The story unfolded with Mimi helping young Robbie Rabbit understand why his grandmother sometimes called him by his father's name, forgot which flowers were her favorites, or needed help finding her way home from the market. "It's not because Grandma loves you less," Mimi explained to Robbie. "It's because her memories are playing hide-and-seek in her mind," Meryl read, her voice gentle but never condescending. "Some days they hide so well that Grandma can't find them, but the love is always there, even when the memories are hiding." Eleanor watched the children's faces as they absorbed the story. A boy with a feeding tube leaned forward intently. Two little girls held hands, nodding in recognition at certain passages. Parents exchanged glances over their children's heads, some wiping away tears as the narrative touched on their own experiences. When Meryl finished reading, she closed the book and smiled at the audience. "What did you think of Mimi's adventure?" she asked the children. Hands shot up immediately, and what followed was possibly the most authentic literary discussion Eleanor had ever witnessed. Children shared stories of their own grandparents' memory issues, asked practical questions about how to help confused relatives, and expressed relief at learning they weren't alone in their experiences. A small boy with no hair and a colorful bandana asked, "Will Mimi write a story about kids who get really sick? Because sometimes the other kids at school don't understand." Julia Peterson stepped forward. "Actually, Mimi has another adventure coming soon that might help with exactly that," she said, glancing at Eleanor with an encouraging smile. After the formal Q&A concluded, hospital staff distributed copies of the book to each child, while Eleanor and Meryl moved through the room, signing books and talking with families. Eleanor found herself surrounded by parents expressing gratitude for addressing a difficult subject in terms their children could understand. "My mother has advanced dementia," one father confided quietly, his daughter clutching the book to her chest. "We've been struggling to explain why Grandma can't live with us anymore. This will help so much." As the event wound down, Dr. Wilson approached Eleanor with a woman who carried herself with the distinctive authority of a hospital administrator. "Ms. Mason, I'd like to introduce Patricia Gonzalez, our Director of Patient Support Services. She's very interested in discussing potential uses for your books in our family counseling program." As Eleanor was drawn into conversation about the therapeutic applications of Mimi's adventures, she caught Meryl's eye across the room. The acclaimed actress gave her a subtle nod that contained volumes of understanding. Acknowledgement that this moment wasn't about celebrity connections or fortunate interventions, but about Eleanor's work standing on its own merit. The unveiling of Mimi to the world had begun, not with publicity or fanfare, but exactly as Eleanor had first shared her stories years ago, with children who needed them most. 6 months after the successful launch of Mimi Helps Grandma Remember, Eleanor sat at her desk staring at the blank screen of her new laptop, a practical purchase made possible by her book advance. Outside her apartment window, autumn painted Washington Heights in brilliant yellows and reds, but inside the atmosphere felt considerably less vibrant. The tremor in her hands had returned with unexpected intensity 3 days earlier, coinciding with a deadline for final revisions on her second book, Mimi and the Invisible Battle. Her phone rang, the specialized ringtone she'd assigned to Meryl, but Eleanor let it go to voicemail. It was the third call she'd ignored that week. Next to her laptop sat a half-finished cup of tea and a letter from Little Harbor Press, expressing enthusiasm about early bookstore orders for her second book, along with a gentle reminder about the revision deadline. The clinical trial that had initially improved her symptoms had plateaued, a development Dr. Sharma had warned might happen. "MS is unpredictable," she had explained during Eleanor's last appointment. "We need to adjust expectations and possibly treatment approaches." Eleanor flexed her fingers, attempting to loosen the stiffness that made typing increasingly difficult. The voice recognition software she now relied on sat unused, her reluctance to speak her story aloud, reflecting a deeper struggle that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with confidence. A knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting visitors, and the building's security intercom hadn't announced anyone. Approaching cautiously, she checked the peephole and was shocked to see Meryl standing in the hallway, holding a canvas tote bag and wearing a concerned expression. Eleanor opened the door, immediately self-conscious about her unwashed hair and rumpled clothing. "I didn't know you were coming by." "That's because you haven't been answering your phone," Meryl replied, her tone gentle but direct. "Julia mentioned you missed your check-in call yesterday. I was worried." Eleanor stepped back to allow Meryl inside, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I've been having a difficult week." Meryl took in the apartment with an observant eye. The unwashed dishes in the sink, the pill bottles arranged in meticulous rows on the counter, the laptop open to a document with only a title and date. She set her tote bag on the table and began unpacking its contents, containers of homemade soup, fresh bread, and a small box from a renowned bakery. "My mother always said food solves nothing but makes everything more bearable," Meryl commented, moving to the kitchen to heat the soup. The easy familiarity of her actions, finding bowls, washing spoons, spoke to the friendship that had deepened between them over the past 6 months. "You didn't need to do this," Eleanor said, hovering uncertainly at the edge of her own kitchen. "Friends check on friends," Meryl replied simply. "Now tell me what's happening with the revisions." Eleanor sank into a chair at her small table, the direct question breaking through her isolation. "I can't finish them. The tremor's worse and the voice software—" She gestured helplessly toward the laptop. "I speak the words, but they come out wrong, stilted, not like Mimi at all. Is it the technology, or is something else going on?" Meryl asked, her perception honed by decades of understanding character motivations. Eleanor stared at her hands. "The first book was already written. I just needed to polish it. This one—" She took a deep breath. "What if I can't do it again? What if I was a one-book wonder at 72? Meryl placed a bowl of steaming soup in front of Eleanor before sitting down with her own. "Julia mentioned the early orders are strong. Librarians are specifically requesting it. Because the first one did well, not because they've read this one." Eleanor picked up her spoon, the tremor making the simple action a concentrated effort. "And I'm not sure I can do the school visits and hospital readings they've planned. Not like this." Meryl watched as Eleanor struggled to bring the spoon to her lips without spilling. "Have you talked to Kate about the increased symptoms?" Appointment. "Next week. She's going to adjust the medication again." Eleanor set the spoon down. "But that doesn't solve my immediate problem. The deadline is in 3 days and I have 4 critical scenes that don't work." "What doesn't work about them?" "They're hollow. When I wrote the first Mimi stories, they came from direct experience. My mother's Alzheimer's, David's death. This one is about a child with leukemia. I've researched extensively, but I haven't lived it. Understanding dawned in Meryl's eyes. You're afraid of getting it wrong, of creating something inauthentic. Eleanor nodded, relief evident that Meryl had articulated her core fear. These books matter to vulnerable children. I can't just make up what I think it might feel like. Meryl was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Have you considered collaborating? With another writer? With the experts? Meryl pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. The hospital has a teen patient advisory board, children who've experienced long-term illness firsthand. What if you consulted with them? Eleanor straightened slightly, intrigued, despite her fatigue. Would that be appropriate? They have enough burdens without being asked to educate me. From what Patricia Gonzalez tells me, they're passionate about improving how people understand their experiences. Your book could be a vehicle for their voices. For the first time in days, a spark of possibility replaced the dull resignation in Eleanor's eyes. That could work, if they're willing. Meryl set down her phone. I'll make some calls, but first, you need to eat. They shared the soup in more companionable silence, Eleanor gradually relaxing as nourishment and company eased her isolation. After the meal, Meryl insisted on washing the accumulated dishes while Eleanor made fresh tea. There's something else, Eleanor finally admitted, watching Meryl dry the last bowl. A practical matter I've been avoiding. Your lease renewal, Meryl guessed correctly. Eleanor nodded. The rent is increasing by 20%. Even with the book advance, I can't make the numbers work long term, especially with the medical expenses the trial doesn't cover. Have you considered the author-in-residence apartment at Little Harbor? The one Julia mentioned? Above the publishing house? Eleanor shook her head. It would feel too much like charity. Meryl dried her hands and turned to face Eleanor directly. It's not charity. It's an established program for their authors. The previous resident just moved out after completing her young adult series. The apartment remains empty until they select the next recipient. And you think I should apply? I think you should consider all your options before dismissing any of them. Meryl's tone remained gentle but firm. Growth is rarely comfortable, Eleanor. Later, after Meryl had left with promises to arrange the meeting with the Teen Advisory Board, Eleanor returned to her desk with renewed purpose. She opened the voice recognition software and spoke clearly, despite her trembling hands. Mimi knew that brave didn't mean not being scared. Brave meant doing important things even when you were scared. The words appeared on screen, imperfect but present, a beginning rather than an ending. On her phone was a text from Meryl with contact information for both Patricia Gonzalez at the hospital and Julia's assistant regarding the residency application. Growth was indeed uncomfortable, Eleanor reflected as she continued dictating. But stagnation had proven far worse. 1 year had passed since Eleanor's desperate approach at Lincoln Center, a milestone marked not by the exchange of a single check, but by the ripples of transformation that continued to expand outward. The conference room at Mount Sinai Hospital hummed with purposeful energy, as Eleanor, seated at the head of the table, reviewed the final draft of the mission statement projected on the screen before her. The Storytellers Health Collective, she read aloud, her voice steady and clear, dedicated to supporting creative professionals facing chronic illness and disability while amplifying their unique perspectives through mentorship, healthcare, advocacy, and sustainable publishing opportunities. Around the table sat an unlikely assembly, Dr. Catherine Sharma representing Mount Sinai's Neurology Department, Julia Peterson from Little Harbor Press, Patricia Gonzalez from New York Presbyterians, Patient Support Services, 3 publishing professionals, 2 healthcare administrators, and Meryl, whose quiet presence at Eleanor's right hand symbolized the journey from that first encounter to this moment of creation. I think it captures the essence perfectly, Julia commented, making a final note on her tablet. Focused enough to have clear purpose, broad enough to grow organically. Eleanor nodded, the tremor in her hands minimal today thanks to her adjusted medication protocol. The past year had brought medical ups and downs, but Dr. Sharma's persistence had finally yielded a combination therapy that provided reasonable stability most days. The initial funding structure is secure, Patricia added, distributing financial summaries to the group. Little Harbor's commitment to donate 10% of profits from the Mimi series, combined with Mount Sinai's space allocation and the matching grant from the Williams Foundation, gives us operational capacity for the first 3 years. Eleanor still marveled at how quickly the concept had evolved from a personal coping mechanism into a structured organization. The catalyst had been her meeting with the Teen Patient Advisory Board 6 months earlier. What was intended as a simple consultation for her second book had transformed into an ongoing collaboration that revealed a significant gap in support. For creative professionals navigating serious illness, the mentorship program is what excites me most, Eleanor said, turning to the next agenda item. We've already received 43 applications from writers, illustrators, and digital content, creators who have chronic conditions or disabilities. And 12 established professionals have volunteered as mentors, Julia added, not just from publishing but film, theatre, and visual arts as well. Meryl, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. The key is sustainability. This can't be built around celebrity appearances or one-time donations. Exactly why the publishing partnership is so crucial, Eleanor agreed. The anthology series provides ongoing revenue while showcasing work from program participants. The projected slide changed to show the cover of Visible Stories of Illness and Creation, the first anthology from the collective, scheduled for release in 3 months. The striking cover featured artwork from a painter with Parkinson's disease, its vibrant colors defying expectations about limitations. As the meeting progressed to implementation details, Eleanor found herself momentarily distracted by the contrast between this conference room and the Lincoln Center Cafe, where she had reluctantly shown Meryl her prescription a year earlier. She now lived in the author-in-residence apartment above Little Harbor Press, a light-filled space that accommodated her physical needs while positioning her at the center of creative activity. Her Mimi books had expanded to a successful series with translations underway in 6 languages, and hospitals across the country used them in child life programs. Yet what gave her the most satisfaction was currently displayed on the conference room screen, a practical framework to support others facing the isolation and career disruption she had experienced. Eleanor, Dr. Sharma's voice drew her back to the present. We were discussing the medical consultation component. Would you share your thoughts on how it should be structured? Eleanor refocused, addressing the group with the clarity that had once made her a sought-after journalist. Direct access to specialists must remain central. When I met Dr. Sharma through Meryl, it wasn't just about obtaining treatment, it was about being taken seriously as a patient with complex needs. That dignity is what we must extend to everyone in the program. Catherine nodded. We've secured commitments from specialists in 8 different departments to provide initial consultations. The challenge is creating pathways to ongoing care. That's where the advocacy training becomes essential, Patricia interjected. Teaching participants to navigate insurance systems, access clinical trials, and understand their rights as patients. The discussion continued, with Eleanor guiding the conversation toward practical implementation rather than theoretical ideals. At 73, she brought a pragmatist's perspective to the Foundation's development. There was no time for approaches that sounded admirable, but delivered little actual support. As the meeting concluded, staff began gathering materials, while board members broke into smaller discussions. Meryl remained seated beside Eleanor, both women watching the energy their collaboration had generated. This wouldn't exist without you, Eleanor said quietly. Meryl shook her head. It wouldn't exist without that notebook of Mimi stories you'd been creating for years without any expectation of recognition. I just happened to see what was already there. Eleanor considered this perspective. Perhaps we're both right. Your intervention created possibility, but the content had to have value of its own. And now it's creating possibilities for others, Meryl observed, gesturing toward the mission statement still displayed on screen. Julia approached, tablet in hand. The printer needs final approval on the anthology introduction. Do you have time to review it today? I'll come down to the office after lunch, Eleanor replied. I'm meeting with the Teen Advisory Board at 1 to discuss the hospital workshop series. As Julia departed, Meryl studied her friend with quiet appreciation. "You've built quite a schedule for someone who was worried about making it to medical appointments a year ago." Eleanor smiled, acknowledging the transformation. "Purpose is a powerful motivator." Dr. Sharma joined them, medical files tucked under her arm. "Your latest results are encouraging, Eleanor. The combination therapy continues to show good stability." She glanced at her watch. "I have patients waiting, but I wanted to mention the research division is interested in studying the impact of creative engagement on neurological symptoms. Your experience might be the foundation for a formal study." After Catherine left, Eleanor gathered her materials, using the specialized tote bag designed to accommodate her physical limitations while maintaining professional appearance, one of many adaptive tools she'd incorporated into her new normal. "Lunch before your meeting," Meryl suggested, falling into step beside Eleanor as they left the conference room. "Actually, I need to finish revising Chapter 4 of the new manuscript. My editor sent notes yesterday." Meryl smiled at the gentle refusal, recognizing it as evidence of Eleanor's reclaimed independence. Their friendship had evolved beyond the initial helper-help dynamic into something balanced and mutually enriching. As they parted in the hospital lobby, Meryl toward a waiting car, Eleanor toward the publishing house 2 blocks away, neither woman needed to acknowledge the anniversary of their chance encounter. Its significance lay not in the date itself, but in the foundation taking shape around them, built on a simple principle Eleanor had articulated during their very first tea. Dignity mattered as much as assistance. The Storytellers Health Collective would soon support dozens, then hundreds of creative professionals navigating illness and disability. But it began with a single story about a mouse named Mimi, written in trembling handwriting on days when hope seemed in short supply. Bernardsville. High school hadn't changed much in the 55 years since Eleanor and Meryl had roamed its hallways as teenagers. The brick facade remained solid and institutional. The trophy cases in the main corridor still displayed achievements, both recent and historical. And the auditorium where they had performed in school plays retained its familiar wooden seats and slightly musty aroma. Today, however, the auditorium buzzed with a different energy as students filed in for a special Career Day presentation. On stage, a simple podium stood beside a display featuring Eleanor's Mimi books, anthology collections from the Storytellers Health Collective, and a poster announcing the organization's 3-year anniversary celebration. In the small green room, behind the stage, Eleanor adjusted her blouse and checked her reflection in the mirror. At 74, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had rediscovered her purpose. The tremor in her hands remained, but she had learned to incorporate it into her public persona rather than hide it, a visible reminder of the challenges that had shaped her work. "Nervous?" asked Dr. Lydia Patel, the neurologist who had taken over Eleanor's care when she transitioned from the clinical trial to standard treatment. The young doctor had accompanied Eleanor today, both as medical support and as a speaker for the health careers portion of the program. "Not nervous," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "Reflective. The last time I was on this stage, I was playing Lady Macbeth opposite Arthur Miller's son." She smiled at the memory. "Meryl was furious I didn't get the part," Dr. Patel laughed. "I can't imagine anyone refusing Meryl Streep anything. Oh, our drama teacher was immune to her charm, said she needed to experience rejection to develop as an actress." Eleanor adjusted the glasses that now framed her face. "I'd say the strategy worked out rather well for her." The door opened and the school's principal entered with an excited expression. "Ms. Mason, we have a surprise for your presentation today. Several former teachers have come specifically to see you speak." "Former teachers?" Eleanor questioned. "From when I was a student?" The principal nodded. "Mrs. Callahan from the English department. She must be nearly 90 now, but she insisted on attending when she heard you were our keynote speaker." A wave of emotion washed over Eleanor. Catherine Callahan had been the first person to recognize her writing talent, the teacher, who had encouraged her to pursue journalism when women were still largely relegated to the society pages. That she would make the effort to attend this full-circle moment felt somehow fitting. The classroom bell rang through the speaker system, signaling the beginning of the assembly. The principal excused himself to start the proceedings, leaving Eleanor and Dr. Patel to wait for their introduction. Through the curtain, Eleanor could hear the rustling of hundreds of students settling into their seats, the unique acoustics of teenage restlessness gradually quieting as the principal began speaking. She caught fragments of her own biography being shared. Award-winning journalist, children's author, founder of the Storytellers Health Collective, Bernardsville High School class of 1967. And so, it is my great pleasure to welcome back one of Bernardsville's most accomplished alumni, the principal concluded. Please join me in welcoming Eleanor Mason. The applause was polite if not enthusiastic. These students had been born long after Eleanor's journalistic heyday, and children's book authors rarely achieved rockstar status among teenagers. Yet as she walked to the podium, her gait steady, despite the cane she now used for balance, she spotted Mrs. Callahan in the third row, her ancient hands clapping with surprising vigor. "Thank you for that warm welcome," Eleanor began, adjusting the microphone. "Looking out at you today, I see echoes of my own time in these seats, the athletes clustered together, the academic achievers in the front rows, the creatives sketching. In notebooks rather than listening to speakers." A ripple of recognition moved through the audience, several students shifting guiltily at being so accurately described. "I won't pretend that my career path has been straightforward," she continued. "The journey from the school newspaper to national magazines to children's books about a brave little mouse named Mimi certainly wasn't what I envisioned when I sat where you're sitting now." She held up her hands, allowing the tremor to be visible to everyone. "Multiple sclerosis changed my physical capabilities, but it also unexpectedly created a new chapter in my creative life. The limitations became, paradoxically, a doorway to possibilities I hadn't imagined." For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor shared her story with remarkable candor. The years of success, the personal losses, the medical challenges, and the unexpected revival of her creative career at an age when many peers had retired. She spoke about the Storytellers Health Collective without romanticizing its work, emphasizing the practical impact of connecting creative professionals with medical resources and mentorship. 3 years ago, she explained, what began as a desperate request for help has grown into an organization that now supports over 200 writers, artists, and creators, managing chronic conditions and disabilities across the country. As she described the collective's work, she noticed several students leaning forward with increased interest, not the usual suspects from the newspaper club, but quieter students whose attention suggested personal connection to her message. "Many of you have family members facing health challenges," she acknowledged. "Some of you may be managing conditions yourselves. What I want you to understand today is that physical limitations don't define your capabilities, and asking for help isn't surrendering your independence. It's creating new pathways to achieve your goals." When she opened the floor for questions, hands shot up throughout the auditorium. Instead of the expected inquiries about famous people she'd interviewed or how to get published, the students asked about navigating college with chronic illness, how to support friends with health challenges, and whether creativity itself could be therapeutic. After the formal presentation, while Dr. Patel participated in a health careers breakout session, Eleanor found herself surrounded by a smaller group of intensely interested students. Among them was a girl using forearm crutches who clutched a dog-eared copy of the latest Mimi book. "I read this to my little brother when he was in the hospital," she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "It helped him understand his treatments better than anything the doctors said. I want to create stories like that someday." Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Callahan appeared at the edge of the group, her eyes bright despite her frail frame. "You always had a gift for making difficult subjects accessible," the elderly teacher said, echoing words she had spoken to Eleanor over 50 years earlier. "I told you your voice would matter." As the students dispersed for their next session, Eleanor found herself alone with her former teacher, the woman who had first recognized her potential before Eleanor herself understood it. "You've come full circle," Mrs. Callahan observed, her voice thin but clear. "Using your challenges to illuminate the path for others." Eleanor took the older woman's hand, feeling the connection across generations. "I had good teachers," she replied simply, "in literature and in life." The Allen Room at Lincoln Center glowed with soft lighting on a December evening 5 years after Eleanor's fateful request. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a glittering Manhattan skyline, the same city that had once seemed indifferent to her struggles, now serving as backdrop to a celebration of connection and creativity. The space hummed with conversation as guests circulated, authors, medical professionals, publishing executives, and artists brought together by the 5th anniversary of the Storytellers Health Collective. At the center of it all stood the Creative Wellness Center, not merely as a concept but rendered in architectural models and vibrant digital displays. The converted brownstone in Chelsea, purchased with proceeds from Eleanor's successful Mimi series and matching grants from institutional partners, would soon provide workspace, medical consultation rooms, and adaptive technology for creative professionals managing chronic conditions. Eleanor moved through the gathering with practiced ease, her silver hair elegantly styled, her outfit professional but comfortable. The cane she now used permanently was custom-made, featuring an ergonomic handle that accommodated her hand tremor, while making a fashion statement rather than a medical one. At 76, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had built something meaningful from personal adversity. "Ms. Mason," called a young woman approaching with recording equipment. "I'm Sophia Lynn from WNYC. Would you have a moment to discuss the center's impact for our Health Innovation series?" Eleanor nodded, guiding the reporter toward a quieter corner. "Of course, though there are many others here who can speak to different aspects of the work," Sophia positioned her microphone. "The Creative Wellness Center represents a significant evolution from what began as a personal connection between you and Meryl Streep. How do you view that trajectory?" Eleanor smiled, the question cutting directly to the heart of the evening's significance. "Every transformation begins with a moment of vulnerability," she replied. 5 years ago, I approached Meryl out of desperation, asking for $100 for medication I couldn't afford. What could have been a brief transaction, money given, gratitude expressed, lives continuing separately, instead became a catalyst for something neither of us anticipated. "Was it Meryl's celebrity that made the difference?" Sophia asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Her influence certainly opened doors that might have remained closed to me, but the collective's success stems from addressing a genuine need with practical solutions. Celebrity attention might launch an initiative, but only meaningful impact sustains it." Across the room, Eleanor spotted Meryl in conversation with Dr. Sharma and Julia Peterson, the 3 women who had formed the initial support network, now standing as equal collaborators in the expanded vision. Meryl caught her eye briefly, offering a warm smile before returning to her discussion. "The Mimi series has now sold over 1 million copies worldwide," Sophia continued. "Did you ever imagine such success when you were writing stories for neighborhood children?" "Never," Eleanor admitted. Candidly, those stories were healing tools for me as much as for the children who heard them. That they found wider resonance speaks to our universal need to make sense of difficult experiences through narrative." The reporter gestured toward the architectural model. "The center will be fully accessible and technologically equipped for various disabilities." How important was that element in the design? "Essential," Eleanor replied firmly. "Too often accommodations are treated as afterthoughts or special requests rather than fundamental design principles. We wanted a space that inherently welcomes diverse physical needs without requiring explanations or apologies." As the interview concluded, Eleanor noticed a small commotion near the entrance. A group of teenagers from the hospital advisory board had arrived, some using wheelchairs or mobility devices, all dressed for the special occasion. Among them was Marisol Rodriguez, now 18 and heading to college the following fall, who had been instrumental in refining the second Mimi book 3 years earlier. Eleanor excused herself from the reporter and made her way toward the young people who represented the collective's future, not merely as recipients of support, but as emerging voices with their own creative contributions. "Ms. Mason," Marisol greeted her with a hug. "We brought something for the center." She gestured to one of her companions, who opened a portfolio to reveal artwork created by the teen group. Illustrations showing diverse young people engaged in creative pursuits, their medical devices incorporated naturally rather than hidden or emphasized. For the entrance hall, Marisol explained, so people see themselves represented from the moment they walk in. Eleanor studied the artwork, deeply moved by how perfectly it captured the collective's philosophy. "It's perfect," she said simply. "The center belongs to your generation far more than to mine." As the evening progressed toward the formal program, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone near the windows, taking in the panoramic view of the city. So much had changed in 5 years. Her health stabilized, though not cured, her career reinvented. Rather than merely extended, her purpose clarified through challenge rather than despite it. "Penny for your thoughts," came Meryl's familiar voice as she joined Eleanor at the window. "I was just thinking about circles," Eleanor replied. "How we're back at Lincoln Center, where it all began." Meryl nodded, understanding the significance, though under slightly different circumstances. "Slightly," Eleanor agreed with wry humor, gesturing to the elegant gathering. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two women in their 70s who had found unexpected connection at a time in life when many friendships fade rather than form. "A reporter asked me what was the most valuable thing you gave me," Eleanor said finally. "She expected me to mention the money or the publishing connections." "And what did you tell her?" Meryl asked. "That you saw me. Not just my need or my illness, but my capacity. That recognition is what allows people to rebuild with dignity." Before Meryl could respond, Julia approached to indicate it was time for the program to begin. The two friends moved toward the podium, where they would jointly announce the center's spring opening. As Eleanor prepared to address the gathering, she noted the diverse assembly, medical professionals who had volunteered their expertise, authors who had mentored newcomers, foundation, representatives who had provided funding, and most importantly, creators who had found pathways through illness rather than dead ends. The legacy taking shape before her wasn't measured in book sales or buildings, but in the network of connections that would continue expanding long after her own story concluded. What had begun with a desperate request for $100 had evolved into something more valuable than money alone could ever provide, a community where vulnerability became strength, limitations sparked innovation, and dignity remained central to every interaction. Eleanor stepped to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice clear and confident. "5 years ago, I stood on these grounds believing I was at the end of my story," she began. "I was mistaken. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us who have discovered that our greatest contributions often emerge from our deepest challenges." The room fell silent, attendees recognizing they were witnessing not just a milestone for an organization, but the culmination of a personal journey that had expanded to include them all, a legacy of transformation that had begun with a simple, desperate request and one person's decision to respond with more than money alone.